I want to send a special thank you to ClayShare for sponsoring this episode of the podcast. Through their online ceramic education platform, they offer hundreds of full-length classes, as well as thousands of instructional videos that can be streamed straight to your smart TV or compatible device. They offer a wide range of topics that are perfect for the beginner to the experienced potter. With your membership, you'll receive weekly live tutorial broadcasts, access to virtual workshops with well-known artists, and special discounts on ceramic supplies. If you sign up today, use the offer code RAMBLER25 to receive a 25% discount on your first 3 months. For more information, check out clayshare.com. Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 370 of the podcast. Thank you guys for tuning in. Today on the show, I talk with sculptor Ryan Wilson Kelly about his large-scale figure sculptures. He works in both clay and paper mache, where he makes figures that are staged in theatrical narrative scenes. In this interview, we talk about the influence of puppetry on his work, as well as how working in multiple mediums allows him to upscale the size of his work to larger than life size. Before we get to that interview, I wanted to thank the folks that have been donating to our Patreon fund drive. I'd like to specifically thank Anne-Marie Toga, who just recently signed up as a year-long supporter. The folks that are supporting through Patreon have exclusive access to the Tales from the Vault podcast feed that features episodes that are no longer available on major podcast servers. I'm in the process of editing and remastering Season 2 of the show, and I just uploaded an interview I did in 2014 with Julia Galloway. If you'd like to hear that, you can make a donation at patreon.com/redclayrambler. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. So let's start talking about puppeteering and how you've been influenced by that, both like the sets, but also just the idea of characters interacting with each other.
Yeah, so when I was still an undergrad at Kansas City Art Institute, I had a summer internship at the Detroit Institute of Arts through their education department. And then I continued on working there off and on for the next few years. And while I was there, they were putting on a show of their puppet collection. And they have this amazing collection that rarely sees the light of day. But like they have the original Kermit the Frog. And in any case, as being in the education department, I had the opportunity to make an educational display. So I got to make like the hands-on puppets that, parents and children would use when they came to this puppet exhibition. Like, all the fancy puppets were behind glass, but I got to make like shadow puppets and hand puppets that were used, people could put their hands on. And I would say, it's just been an interest of mine that has, continued on. Just understanding the mechanics and the aesthetics of those things, all the different traditions around the world, and the way that they're physical objects that people make that are then used in storytelling in a way that I view a lot of my stuff as like objects that I make that are then manipulated or used to help communicate a story.
When you're thinking about trying to teach people about sort of a history, because it was a puppet exhibition, you were looking at historical puppets, you're sort of the interface between the past and the present. So how did you design the puppets so that kids would be interested both in what you were going to do, but also to look in the displays and, look at old things?
I mean, I think what I was looking at was the way that, specifically, I think there were like these Turkish shadow puppets, like in the collection, that are made out of this like translucent vellum or some sort of leather or something, and they're colored, so they almost, when they're lit from behind, they're not just like a black shadow. But when you look at the cutouts in their faces, they had like such weirdly expressive faces. And I mean, the same carried through in a lot of the other puppets within that collection. And I think I used that, like trying to figure out how to create interesting characters where the face would really kind of grab the attention. And also how like a simple like hinge or simple joint or simple mechanism could help to activate a inanimate object, so that your manipulation of that simple thing could become transformative in some way. Your kind of engagement with that static object makes it come to life, and that kind of puppet magic happens.
When we think about puppets, there's what the person is seeing, whatever the face, the mask, the moving part is. But then there's the puppeteer, so there could or could not be voices. There could be lights. There could be music. I guess it just depends on like what era of puppeteering that you look at. But having to get a lot of information set on one facial expression would make me feel like there's a lot of pressure. So how do you get a facial expression that's expressive and then back that up with either music, or in your case, you make large ones and sometimes make them in videos?
So there are like actual tricks. And again, I should say I'm totally self-taught in terms of puppetry and in a lot of things as well. But before we go into the face, I would say that there are, like, in sculpting puppets' hands for like marionettes. I was working, later on, I had a job briefly working at a puppet theater in Philadelphia called the Mum Puppet Theater. And the woman I was working with suggested that when you're sculpting hands for puppets, like marionettes, that you have this kind of like split finger, like this closed palm, but like with the fingers split. And depending on how you manipulate that, the angle at which that hand is moved, it can represent a lot of different gestures. So it could be active, it could be passive. And then in terms of a face, having an asymmetrical expression. So if like you're like squinting on one side and not squinting on the other, if one eyebrow is raised, then depending on how you position that head towards the viewer or the camera, you can elicit a different type of emotion out of that character. It is tricky though, and I think it comes down to that suspension of disbelief, that once you get into the kind of mentality, like kind of forget that the puppeteer is there and just kind of give over to the idea that this character is alive, you can kind of get past the fact that it's still a static object and start to just imagine things that aren't actually even happening, like facial expressions that might stay static, but because it's moving in space, you're really kind of imagining what that character is thinking or doing.
I'm so glad you brought that up, that suspension of disbelief. Like as children, when we see puppets, we automatically do that. Like I think kids can go into the imaginary space faster, but with your ceramic and larger sculpture, paper mache sculpture, you're essentially using scale to then make an adult human into a installation space in which hopefully maybe they will suspend their disbelief and get caught up in the moment of the installation. So can you talk about like when you or what you've taken from puppetry and then applied that to the larger sculpture and installations that you make?
Not everything that I have made, especially recently, has been meant as a interactive, performative space. A lot of them are meant as kind of static installations where the viewer enters into the space and has kind of like a passive relationship with the environment. But I think that sense of scale where you are entering into a space and the physical objects are at your scale or larger, you kind of inherently have this the sense that these things you have to navigate around them. You have to kind of share space with them. They're not in a the pictorial space of a painting or a photograph, but they are occupying the same space as you. So you have to kind of confront them, or they confront you in some way. And I think a couple of recent installations that I've done that have like giant puppet like heads or puppet characters, I think the idea is that you almost become a player in this like oversized puppet installation. So you're trying to imagine what the narrative might be, trying to put these connections together. But because it is a static presentation, my hope is also that you see the potential for these things to interact, that there isn't one set narrative, that these are props or tools in the construction of a narrative. So as much as I might be presenting them with something in mind, I think I want viewers to see like, oh, this is where I might take these things. This is where my imaginative leap might make an association between these two characters, or between, a certain object and a character.
So when you were at the Kansas City Art Institute, you were, making clay, you were making a lot of different things. And your practice as you went forward into grad school and past that has been kind of a dual practice. Can you talk about becoming comfortable talking through multiple mediums?
I don't know that the talking part has ever gotten more comfortable, but I think, okay, when I was at Kansas City, it was an amazing cohort of folks pushing each other and really feeding off of each other's creativity. And obviously we had, incredible professors as well. But I remember, feeling like I could make interesting sculptures, but they always felt kind of dead to me. Like once they came out of the kiln and you like set it on a pedestal, that there was almost like a death that happened. Like its life didn't continue on. In a sense, like, people who are making functional work, that work has a life beyond coming out of that kiln. It has this interactive component. And so even in undergrad, I started making pieces that were interactive in like the simplest of ways. Like I made a number of pieces that had like a metal structure that you could turn a crank and it would like activate a ceramic thing. And other things where I was like creating an installation, like taking these small objects and positioning them in some sort of, imaginary domestic space, just to kind of activate them and to put them into a more kind of playful, like unfinished state where they still retain that potential. And then moving into graduate school, I went to Ohio State, and I was evaluating a lot of my concepts and my subject matter, and wanting to make use of as many of the resources available, and also wanting to make use of the facilities. Like they had, these amazing kilns, and, I wanted to work on a large scale, like have this sense of scale that we were talking about earlier. And I made a series of really large busts, ceramic busts that were, I think, over like 3 feet tall. And they were to kind of celebrate this kind of weird little story that I had found in the news, with connecting Lou Reed and Madeleine Albright and Václav Havel. In any case, like it took so long to make these 3 giant ceramic busts that by the end, by the time I had finished making those pieces, like the absurdity of this moment that I was trying to commemorate seemed kind of stale. And to enliven that, I made giant paper mache versions of these same characters. And that's where like my first real experiment with paper mache and that kind of large scale came in. And I was able to kind of examine this little story I was trying to celebrate through a different medium in a more quick, expressive way. And it also brought in the possibility of this interactive or performative element where people could, put on a paper mache head and become Madeleine Albright, at least for a short time. And that has continued on, that process of making these large interactive kind of mask-like structures. It has just like opened up this world of scale and color, and also like the quickness with which I can make things. It allows me to work through ideas or work through concepts a bit more quickly, without them becoming stale in that same way. And then when I do use ceramic components, I'm using them for where the material has its like, I'm looking for that solidity or that sense of time or the way that ceramic material conveys like a material weight that it's bringing to a sculpture or an installation.
Can you talk about the actual process of paper mache? Because, we do that like as kids. I made the balloon and then you put it on the outside and pop the balloon. But like if you're going to make a gigantic head, the heads, we should say, are like about the size of a human torso. So then when you put it on top of your torso, you become really tall. So how do you do that? Like what's the structure underneath?
When I was at Ohio State doing this in the basement of Hopkins Hall, I thought that I was like inventing my own practice, and have since found, multiple examples of other people doing the exact same process. But what I kind of figured out, incidentally, was I made a plaster dummy head. So it's kind of like a neutral, blank face, and then use water-based clay to just build up features on top of that, kind of like Mr. Potato Head, so that I wouldn't have to build like a solid clay form, but I could, change the features around and make different characters. And it's a process I still use today. And I'm able to use that clay, that water-based clay that I have this deep familiarity with. I love sculpting and modeling out of clay, and I feel confident in my ability to capture faces with that material and to do it fairly quickly, especially if you're working solid. And then once I've captured the face or whatever it is that I'm sculpting, I cover that with a thin layer of plastic and then build up 3 layers of brown paper dipped in a paper mache paste, and kind of build up a shell around that clay form. And once that's dry, usually I dry it in front of a fan, the paper kind of shrinks around the form, just like your balloon that you were just talking about. And then I'll have to make release cuts in the form to kind of pop it off of that form. So yeah, that's kind of like the general process. And then oftentimes I'll be mixing and matching additional materials. Like once I've got that main form, I might reinforce parts with foam or cardboard. I might, in a lot of cases, I'll be gluing ceramic eyes or teeth into a structure. But the main thing comes from that shell made over a clay sculpted form.
So when you start with that base form, like the plaster form, we talked about the scale of these heads is really big. Like, is that a solid plaster thing? Because that would also be super heavy. Or is there then another thing inside of that?
So the dummy head I have, I have a couple of them. Some of them are a little bit heavier, but they are built on kind of a lazy Susan. I think there's like a 2x4 in the middle with like a chicken wire mesh shell, and then maybe it's like a 2-inch skin of plaster. So it's heavy, it's awkward, but it's not like 100 pounds of plaster. These things do get quite heavy when I'm in that process, but it's I've got a really hefty studio table that can that can sustain a fairly hefty amount of clay.
Do you work on, like, say you're working on plaster on one side and then on the other side of your studio you're working on clay on a different head? Or do you generally like work with one head all the way from the plaster to the clay to the paper mache?
I would say if I'm working on like a series of heads, I would do the sculpting in the clay and get that paper mache shell made, get that dried, and pull that off of the form. And then it might, I might stabilize it and repair it, but it might hang out while I, like, if I'm making a grouping, I might kind of do work in a kind of like a production method so that I'm making all of these, like the sculpting first, and then I'll set aside time to go back and, reinforce and refine the pieces that I had been making. And the way you're asking this, it's kind of reminding me of like how I, when I'm teaching ceramics, how I might tell people to, like, if you're throwing a bunch of mugs that need handles, like you would throw those, like getting that production sense, and then like set aside time to make your handles. And, it is this kind of like ordering in which I do things.
A lot of the work, or at least the earlier work I saw, became you acting with the heads on top of your body and then acting within a scenario. So you would, either build a set. I'm thinking of that piece with the big rocking horse that you were on. What's the name of that one?
It's called Mazeppa, and it's based off of a Lord Byron poem called by the same name.
One of the things I thought was interesting is that you built this gigantic, it doesn't exactly look like a hobby horse, but it's that style of horse, and it rocks back and forth, and then you're laying on it, and then you have a head on it, on you. So altogether, this is like, how many feet is this? Like, this had to be in a gigantic space you were working.
Well, I think in that one, I'm actually not wearing a head, but I am on this, almost life-size horse. And it is the body of the rocking part is built with plywood, so it could support my weight, and I could rock without it falling apart. But then the tail, the head, the legs are all paper mache. So and it's painted to have this kind of trompe l'oeil effect to make it look more dimensional. But yeah, that was for a show. I was a part of, like, a group show in Philadelphia at the Fleischer Art Memorial, and it's this crazy old arts nonprofit that's connected to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and the oldest part of that building is actually a former synagogue that has this, like, kind of, it's a small space, but it has this kind of grandeur of a synagogue. I think the where I was photographed was in the gallery space, kind of off of there. So I was hoping, when I made it, I was hoping that it would be situated and filmed in the grander space. But in the end, it is kind of like there's like a drop ceiling that you can see in some of the pictures that I usually try and crop out.
I love the idea, though, of that being a playful gesture, like the rocking horse. But then tell us about the Lord Byron poem. Like, it's both childlike, but then really not so childlike. So can you talk about that poem, where it came from?
Okay, so I should say that the performances that I have done, in a lot of times where I am like actively performing, partly out of necessity or lack of funding, I'm usually the only person in them, and they start to take on a quality about me. And a theme that kind of arose out of that, and out of other things, was the sense of the solitary figure, and the solitary figure maybe engaged in labor or engaged in some sort of practice. So I had done a thing on Robinson Crusoe, Superman and his Fortress of Solitude, Hercules and his 12 labors. So I was kind of peeking through to find, examples of like an individual kind of struggling or working towards something. And the concept of the Byronic hero kept coming up. And, that comes from Lord Byron, and he kind of epitomized this character of this kind of like brooding bad boy in literature. And I had seen, images of, tchotchkes and decorative prints and other things that are kind of from the early 19th century celebrating these Lord Byron poems, including like a Staffordshire flatback vase, like this little kind of cheap trinket vase with this naked guy strapped to a zebra. And I love ceramic history. So I was like, I love this thing. And then I saw the name Mazeppa on it and I was like, that's a Lord Byron poem. So I went back and read the poem. Don't really like Lord Byron or his poetry or this poem in particular, but I liked the kind of the concept, the behind it, where the main character has committed some sort of offense, and his punishment is to be stripped bare, tied to a horse, and then the horse is sent off into the forest. And the bulk of the poem is like this kind of frothy retelling of his, like the horse jumping through brambles and wolves attacking him and the gnashing of the teeth. And then ultimately he arises, he makes it to some sort of other place and become like his life continues in a good way. So he like, it's got like a happy ending. But this idea of like being strapped naked to this horse and like enduring this thing seemed like a performance that I could kind of emulate. And there was actually like a 19th century performance that I read about where it was kind of like a pre-vaudeville, but it was like the person portraying Mazeppa was almost like a burlesque performer. It was a woman who would strap herself to a horse and like kind of make this pantomime of this Lord Byron poem. So it was kind of like this titillation of, being stripped bare, being, in this case, she was female. And gosh, I wish I could remember her name. I'll have to go back and look that up now. In my retelling of it, the piece that I made is kind of meant to be kind of an endurance performance where there's not really like a linear narrative like there is in the poem. It's just me and this object kind of rocking back and forth. So rather than, moving in a direction, moving towards some sort of greater triumphal end, at that point in my career, I was feeling pretty stuck. So the metaphor of just being stuck on this rocking horse, not really going one way or another, is where I kind of inserted my own part of the narrative. And yeah, it was a weird performance, I would say. People who came to the opening, it was just me in a loincloth rocking. And I don't think they really knew if something was supposed to happen. It just kept happening.
Well, we're gonna keep talking about you in a loincloth because you told this funny story the other day about making the work about the Herculean, the 12, what are they called?
12 labors of Hercules.
That's right. And you talked about making different sculptures for that, but then also you were making films that supported the sculptures. But what that meant is that you were like running through Chinatown in a loincloth at 6 a.m. so that you could make this video without people, I guess, stopping you or accosting you or whatever. So could you talk about like that aspect of this? Once you have a work in your mind, how do you document that either with photography or video so that people can experience it after the fact?
So I knew that I was going to be having a show. That was when I was still a resident at the Clay Studio in Philly. And I knew I was going to have a show in the gallery and I wanted to fill it with, physical objects. And I developed this theme of like inserting myself as kind of like a poor man's Hercules, it's called Herculean or on artistic labor. And I'm trying to like trying to make a career in Philadelphia at that point. So it felt Herculean, like this almost impossible task. But let's see. I think like once I started making these components and making costumes that would go with it, it just seemed appropriate that I make a video that go along with that. And also to try and, at least at the very least, like stage photographs that I had at the time. I was hoping that I could post, like print those out and have those in the gallery. It was ambitious to try and get all of that done in time for the exhibition, but I should mention, though, at the time that I was making that piece, I was, in addition to my other jobs, I did have this side gig that went for a couple of years, working with a good friend of mine who I'd gone to undergrad and grad school with, Andy Byers. And he was living in New York and had hired me to work with him to make props and costumes for a set of short films. And it ended up being this kind of amazing series of like 30 or 40 short films starring and written by Isabella Rossellini called Green Porno. And so like I was like on set kind of learning all of these things about like learning all the different types of shots and lighting and kind of absorbing that stuff and thinking, like trying to think filmically in terms of like how I would create objects and where they would be placed. And so for that professional stuff, I was, making objects that were being used as puppets. And then, at the same time, I'm making things for myself and trying to imagine how can I, without a full crew, how can I kind of economically activate these things? And it seemed like through like, discrete video shots, through positioning myself in photo shoots, I could kind of communicate that activated kind of scene.
So let's talk about myths, because, Hercules and even the romantic poets like Lord Byron, in a way, those were myths. Literature can be a myth for an era. So why do you think, let me think of how to ask this. What do you think are the core parts of the Herculean myth and also the other myths you've worked with that represent you? Like, how do you place yourself in the work?
You mean literally or conceptually?
Conceptually or philosophically. Because what I'm wondering is, like, there are so many myths. Like, I think in the West, we know Hercules, like, we know that myth. Like, that's something that, actually, it's probably from the 80s or 90s TV show that a lot of people knew that, or a lot of our generation knew that.
Yeah.
But I think for you to choose that myth or to choose a Lord Byron poem, you have to situate yourself mentally in those stories to want to make art about them. So how is it that you find yourself in those stories?
So I think I was always in these pieces where I have kind of inserted myself into a mythological character or a character from popular culture in some way. I'm always looking for someone that there is a comparison, like how I feel about myself to this character who we all have some familiarity with. So there's this inherent dichotomy between me as a person and this ideal or this like known example. So that I think that is like the primary thing of in terms of how I'm inserting myself. And in some cases, that is like a literal physical contrast. So when I did this performance as Superman, I'm kind of like an out of shape guy bald with like a red beard in a homemade spandex costume. Like, I am not Superman. So there's like this inherent kind of visual dichotomy. And then I think when I was inserting myself into the character of Hercules, again, there is this urban component where I was like running around Philadelphia. Again, I'm a really pale white guy with a beard. I don't look like a Greek god, so or demigod. So I feel like they're trying to insert myself into something that has like it allows me to examine myself and my aspirations, examine my sense of masculinity, and also this sense of striving and of labor, of how like someone who we look at Hercules and his achieving of these 12 impossible labors as like this heroic act, but I am not heroic, and my acts that I'm trying to achieve are largely self-driven. They're self-motivated in trying to create a career for myself.
A lot of artists can relate to that. Like, you finish your schooling, you get out, and you're like, what the hell am I going to do now? So there's something about that was so honest about an artist of your age at that time in a big city.
Yeah. Everything that I have done since school has been kind of like embracing opportunities that have come to me, and also just working and trying to figure out like what, like, I don't know if I have time to even think about like planning for the future. I feel like I've always just been like working. And I think that was one of the manifestations of that, like, kind of unknowing frustration. But at least I was trying to put it towards a productive end, like making a physical or making work that kind of could help me think through that.
There's a sense of humor in your work that I think is very poignant. There's this one piece you made about being a scapegoat. Can you talk about what the circumstances of that were and how that manifested into the performance?
Okay, so I don't really want to say too much. I won't mention names. Let's just
talk about it in the abstract.
I was invited to be a visiting artist at a school, and as part of that it was planned that I would do critiques. I would give a talk and also do some sort of performative thing. I was being invited to kind of be the guy that could do performance-based stuff. And then I was disinvited. And I was like, okay, that's weird. I don't know what's going on. And then I was re-invited, which was even weirder. And I, came to feel that there was some bad blood amongst the faculty. And I just was like, you know what? I'm going to do this because, they're offering me money and they're going to pay for me to go there and to do this thing. It's an opportunity to make a work and to participate in something, but I'm going to try and like keep my head down and not be involved in whatever their politics there. So the performance that I made was, it was intended to be something that was fairly simple, that could be set up in a space without having to bring a lot of props. So like a number of other performances I've done in similar situations, I have like a simple canvas backdrop to kind of create just give a little bit of context and color. And then I was sitting on a stool with this big paper mache goat head. And it's based off of a couple of things. Like there's a couple of political cartoons from the 1800s. There's a Thomas Nast cartoon where a character, like someone is placing a goat head on top of some other character. He's the political cartoonist who developed like the donkey as the Democratic Party and the elephant as the Republican Party. A lot of great characters. So he was in this image, he's like placing a scapegoat head on some sort of political figure. And that image has just like stuck with me. And, as someone who's been like absorbing puppetry and paper mache heads and Halloween heads, like things like that, kind of like I have this huge rambling archive of images that I look back to. And I thought the idea of a scapegoat would be perfect, that I could, like, these warring factions within the school they could take it out on me, that like, let me absorb your bad energy. And so I sewed a bunch of bean bags, and the performance was really just me sitting on a stool, and the people were invited to pick up bean bags and throw them at me. And over the course of a couple of hours, they really got into it, and they actually like punctured the paper mache head. Like the bean bags were like coming through the head. So yeah, I don't know that it performed its intended function of some sort of catharsis, but it definitely got into it, I would say.
If I can imagine being them in that experience, they'd be like, oh, this is so much fun. I'm going to pick up this beanbag and try to hit this guy with it or hit this character. But then I would imagine at some point they started to feel bad because then they're like, why are we like, we're arguing with our colleagues. Why are we throwing stuff at this guy?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of like entry points into art making or to the art viewing experience. And when there's performance involved, for some folks that can be, a great invitation. But I think for many people, they might come with this association that like, oh, I'm not going to understand this, or this excludes me in some way. And whether I'm making something that is interactive, performative, or even if it's just static objects, I love to, engage people, not just with like kind of visual cues of like color and mark making and material usage, but to give them the freedom to laugh. When you can get someone to laugh, that is kind of like a universal, there's a generosity in that. You're kind of inviting people into your work. And not all of my work is like, slapstick, but I do hope that invitation is seen as that, like an invitation to go beyond that initial humor and to kind of think about the ideas that I'm presenting as well.
I heard this on a podcast the other day, or it might have been in your talk. I can't remember which one. They're blending together in my head, but someone had said once you get someone to laugh at something, they'll never feel, they either said guilty about it or shameful about it. Was that you that said that?
No, but I like that.
Yeah, and this concept, like you can have something that's a little traumatic or a little, something that you have a bad feeling, but if you can make that funny for someone, it no longer feels bad. It transforms that inner emotion into something different, which I thought was an interesting take.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, I think that a bulk of like at least 20th century American humor came out of people kind of recovering from World War II and the Holocaust and like, dealing with existential angst through humor. And I think you could look to a lot of at least 20th century like comedians and humorists for their kind of making light out of like horrible darkness.
Yeah, now it was a comedian's podcast, so it makes sense that that's what it was. I remembered where it came from. But I wanted to talk more about how all of this work, the papier-mâché work, the puppetry, the performance, how that informs your actual clay work. So right now you have a show up at the Clay Studio where you've referenced Toby jugs in the work, which is something I think that clay people will know. But after seeing the puppetry, it seems to me like that's the stuff that's actually influencing the ceramic forms as much as the historical Toby jugs. So can you talk about that interplay, clay being influenced by other mediums?
Yeah, well, I mean, there has been a continuous through line of use of material. So clay has been in my studio, no matter if I'm making fired ceramic objects or not. I always have my hands in that material. And the pieces that are in this show, and I've been making more of these fired ceramic objects in the last few years, are partly coming out of the fact that I have moved to the West Coast and moved away from a big city. So I'm working within kind of like a smaller studio, working away from a lot of opportunities to show big performative or installation-based work. And one way I've found to like maintain connection to galleries and to shows is to be able to make smaller objects that could be shipped off. And kind of like that's maybe some of the larger context, but in terms of like making the actual objects, they are, I'm choosing to work with these things that are very character based. The Toby jug as this kind of trope is really based around a historical form that is coupled with a poem. And the original Toby is really Tobias Philpott, who was like a drunkard. I mean, I love going down like the rabbit hole of research on these things. And he has a female counterpart. Oh man, but I can't remember her name. But she represents the apparently around the same time gin was introduced to England, and gin houses were usually run by women and it was seen as a more socially acceptable drink for women to consume. And so there's like this kind of companion to the Toby is like this kind of grimacing overweight woman with like a tiny little glass drinking gin. But then all of the other character kind of like facially sculpted little character jugs that are created in England and Royal Dalton and Staffordshire. All these like historical examples are anything that is not representing Toby is technically considered a character mug. And I've loved those things for, since I was a child. I've, I'm making big paper mache masks, but I'm also, have memories of looking at my grandmother's tchotchke shelf and seeing like pirates and like wizened old witch like hags, and like, we never talked about them as a family, but they would just sit up there and I would be like, kind of, my imaginative mind would be like going off like, what are these characters? What are they thinking to each other? What was my grandmother thinking when she got those? Why was she attracted to that pirate? So those things have existed in kind of like my earliest memories of like art objects like existing within a domestic space. And because also this character base, this potential to tell a story, it has led me to making these things and kind of getting into that world. And I would say also the pieces that I've made for this show at the Clay Studio have been made during this pandemic year, and they are all kind of within the tradition of the Toby jug or the character mug. They have kind of grimacing faces, and so kind of taken together, they kind of express this anxiety that I and pretty much everyone has been feeling over this past year of like uncertainty and unease in the world. I'm always looking at the way that other people have captured facial expressions, whether that is in cartoons or like looking at Franz Hall's paintings, or anything where there is like a heightened facial expression. Whenever I'm teaching any sort of like figurative sculpting in my ceramics classes, there's a sculptor of, I think he's Austrian, it's from like the late 1700s, named Franz Xavier Messerschmidt, and all of his sculptures were these like very exaggerated facial features. He did a series of self-portraits where he's like going through all of these facial features, facial expressions, where it's like grimacing, like he is like down to sculpting like the wrinkles around your crow's feet or like the wrinkles around your nose. And I think for him, it was like a way of demonstrating this technical mastery that would, get him commissions. But I love looking at that and trying to kind of decipher how other people have captured an emotion through this facial expression. In terms of like how I am doing that, I would say like I look for, a gesture that can stand in for something larger. And I think that is coupled with the way that I sculpt these things, but then I'm also going back with like a graphic line to emphasize things, or to try and like create almost like a cartoon-like quality that is like really, packing the punch for like a raised eyebrow or something like that, or like a baggy eye.
Well, I'm so glad you brought up those graphic marks. I'm looking at at some of the work, and there's this one anxious Toby jug, which you have kind of this. It's a person sitting down, a man, and he has almost like doe eyes. Like they're almost like bigger than they would be. But then it's actually the graphic lines around it that sell it as being anxious, which I think that combination of the 2D and 3D, I think you even said that in the talk the other day, that you really admire people like Akio Takamori and other artists that can push that 2D, 3D barrier to sell emotion.
Yeah, absolutely. I have loved Akio's work since I was in undergrad. And the way that he would sculpt forms, if you look at the forms kind of ignoring the painted surfaces, they are like his early stuff, his, stuff that he made towards the end of his life, they're still like very subtly sculpted, almost like these softened, kind of potato-like forms. But the way that he activates them then with like these graphic marks and washes, it really completes the form. And there is something of that like suspension of disbelief, like going back to puppetry, where you have like 3 dimensions, 2 dimensions, and your mind is kind of going back and forth. And there's many other people. Like I mentioned Viola Fry the other day. Ellie Nottleman is a sculptor, like a 20th century sculptor that I love looking at for these kind of like softened, muted, the way that the figures are sculpted in this kind of subtle way, and then maybe activated with a simple gesture. But I love that contrast of like a 2-dimensional mark that can kind of like fill in for something that wouldn't really have much dimension, like an eyebrow.
Can you talk about how you build color on the big paper mache objects versus ceramic objects? There's something about the 3-dimensionality of glaze itself that activates the clay things that's not quite there in the paper mache heads. So do you think differently about those two things?
In terms of like the mark making, that is something that is similar. Let's see, with the painting of the heads, like they're made with brown paper, and then I gesso them, and then I kind of come up with like whatever the base tones are, and then the final act is usually going in with like a darker tone and making these kind of defining marks, these mark makings that might define like, pupils in the eyes or wrinkles around the mouth. And so like the color is kind of built up, and then the marks go on top of that as like the final thing. With the ceramic components, or with the ceramic pieces, because of like the different stages of the process, oftentimes I'm putting the marks on in the greenware stage while it's still in that leather hard, and I'm doing like, I put wax on and carve through and do it like an inlaid black slip. And then I'm using translucent glazes over that after it has been fired. So oftentimes like the marks will get, like the glaze might pull some pigment out of those marks. It might drip over the line. And like you said, it has like its own physical dimension. It has its own, like the way light passes through it. It is a different beast entirely. Sometimes it's frustrating because things happen in ceramics. But I think where those things happen in the best possible way, it kind of outshines what can happen when you're just like painting something directly with acrylic paint.
Yeah, I'm looking at this Parrot Mug, which is one of my favorite pieces in the show. An example of this is that the parrot that's on the parrot's shoulder has a green glaze that runs off the parrot and onto the parrot, and it activates this whole thing. And I'm probably saying this because I'm a potter and I love runny glazes, but it's just so active. Like, it's such a beautiful piece. So can you talk about making that one? Like, what's the story behind that one?
Yeah, I mean, that piece has like, I should say I keep sketchbooks, and I have sketchbooks going back like 20 years. I can like find images that I have drawn from memory of the same piece over and over. And I think it comes from a pirate character mug that sat on a shelf in my grandma's home that it was just like burned into my memory. And I don't know why it has stuck with me. It's like, I think the dissonance of like my grandmother and like this pirate character, like why was she collecting pirate fish? I don't know. But I have like drawn that thing and made different versions of sculpted versions of that same piece, basically from memory. And recently when I was making stuff for this show, I was putting together images and looking for examples of Royal Dalton character mugs. Everyone's been stuck inside. I bought a bunch of books on, different websites. I bought a big catalog of like all of Royal Dalton's like character mugs going back 100 years. And there's this pirate mug that I don't really love the way it was sculpted. I look at it and it's like, it's not an object that I would be like gravitating to now. But in my mind's eye, it was like this fantastical object that I loved as a child. So I think I've found what was my grandma's, but it's kind of like this sad recognition when I found it, like, that's actually not that great. So I've been making my own kind of imaginary version of it several times over.
So I wanted to end with a completely stupid question.
Sure.
You have an epic beard. How do you think the way your face has changed as you've aged has informed the way you portray facial expression in your work?
Man, I don't know. I mean, I would say it's really hard to sculpt hair. So you won't find a lot of sculptures of mine of people with beards or with like lots of hair, honestly. Like hair is really hard to sculpt, especially if you're trying to render it in paper mache. I don't know. I also have a weak chin. So however epic my beard might be, it's also like obscuring the fact that I've got like a turkey neck and a weak chin. So like, I think if I were making like a self-deprecating self-portrait, I would probably portray myself with like, without my commanding beard and, be more honest about myself in that way.
Yeah, because I think a lot about people that make figure sculpture. Like, do you find yourself like looking in a mirror to try to figure out like, how do I make someone look anxious, and then look in the mirror and try to look anxious? Or like, because that sounds easy, but I know from hearing actors talk about their process that learning how to use your face to display emotion is actually incredibly hard. Because once you become aware of it, you tend to suppress. We are more naturally emotive when we're not focused on how our face looks.
Yeah. I think I am interested in the thing they might be trying to avoid if I'm picking up. I would say the artifice of something like a puppet or a mask is something like that an actor might be trying to avoid and trying to go for something more subtle. And I think that the archetypes from Commedia dell'arte or like Halloween masks, like I am interested in that kind of stereotypical like conveyance of a physical emotion. So I think when you are acting and you're in a scene where there are other contextual elements, there's sound, there's narrative, there's foreboding, you can convey a lot with a much more subtle expression. But when I'm dealing with like a static object or a puppet or a sculpture, I think I want to kind of lean into that maybe more stereotypical kind of mode of expression. So yeah, if I'm looking at myself in a mirror to kind of capture that, I am like hamming it up. I'm not trying to, create a psychological drama through my facial expression.
So how long does that show up, and where can people see it?
The show is up at the Clay Studio in Philadelphia until I want to say May 3rd. And yeah.
Yeah, and the work looks great. I'll put some images up on the website so people can hopefully go see them there. To wrap up, can you leave both your website and your social media so people could get in touch if they wanted to?
Yeah, sure. My website, which acts kind of as like an archive, I think you mentioned, of stuff going back years, is ryanwilsonkelly.com. My full name, all one big word. And my Instagram, which, is mostly artwork, but, some, silly photos of me. That is at Ryan Wilson Kelly on Instagram. So check me out on Instagram. Hit me up on the DMs.
Well, thanks, man, for taking the time to do the interview. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ben.
I'd like to thank Ryan for taking the time to come on the show. It was a pleasure to meet him and to talk about his work. Before we go, I'd like to send a special thank you to ClayShare. Through their online ceramic education platform, they offer hundreds of full-length classes that can be streamed straight to your smart TV or compatible device. If you sign up today, use the offer code RAMBLER25 and you'll receive a 25% discount on your first 3 months. For more information, visit clayshare.com. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you guys for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.